Welcome to the Staffroom, an education podcast which takes a look into the world of pedagogy. In this series, we meet educators far and wide to chat about teaching and learning and share outstanding practice. My name is Michael Royale, and I'm sitting here with Tessa Johnson, and we're coming to you from Corpus Christi College in Perth, Australia.
In this episode, we will be talking about the ways slow and meaningful practice has an impact on learning. We'll be chatting to the author of the book, Slow Teaching, on finding calm and impact in the classroom. UK-based teacher and author Jamie Thom joins us to share his views on the ways slowing down and taking stock can lead to better teacher well-being and improved student outcomes.
Far too often we're looking at the speedy, quick fix of things, rather than considering, the reflection, the pace that we need to do things in order to make learning gains over time.
We will also be chatting to James Ramsey, a humanities teacher at Corpus Christi College, who will tell us about the practical and effective ways formative assessment is changing the way students receive feedback in his learning area.
In the past, I might have spent hours thinking about how might I start the lesson or how might I end the lesson, and it might have been really fun and engaging, but it took a lot of time, and I'm not necessarily sure that it had a big impact on the learning.
I'm Michael Royale.
And I'm Tessa Johnson.
And this is the Staffroom. So Tessa, we're talking to Jamie Thom and James Ramsey today. What are you looking forward to the most with Jamie's interview?
I'm really looking forward to both interviews today. But Jamie Thom's book is really resonating with me at the moment because it's really about just slowing the process down, and he talks a lot about teacher wellbeing as well. And you and I, Michael, are both pretty early in our teaching careers. We're just a couple of years out, and this is actually quite a critical time, I think, for new teachers to burn out and to get overwhelmed. And he has this nice analogy that he uses at the beginning of his book where he says, a teacher should not be like a candle, like they should not burn out at the expense of giving light and bright to others. And I really connect with that analogy, and his book goes through a lot of different strategies as to how to sustain sort of joy and drive and vigour within the classroom. How about you, Michael? How about James Ramsey? What are you looking forward to there?
Well, James Ramsey's a bit of a gun when it comes to formative assessment at Corpus.
Yes, he is.
Yeah, he is. And I'm just really excited to hear some of the techniques that he's going to be able to suggest to us to use in our classroom and, for teachers in general, because it's such an important thing and makes our job a hell of a lot easier if we have good ways of formatively assessing students.
Yeah, and I've actually worked in humanities with him as my head of department, and some of the things he'd come up with and that would use in the classroom, which is so good and saved so much time as well. So, yeah, he's got some awesome things to say. I know that.
Great. Let's get started, shall we?
Let's do it. Jamie Thom is an English teacher from the northeast of England. After having leadership experience as an assistant head teacher, Jamie is now studying for a Master's in Educational Leadership. Jamie joins us via Skype today to talk about his recent book, Slow Teaching, which is about refocusing our practice and only doing things for the right reasons. So, hi Jamie, and thank you so much for joining us today. Could you just tell our listeners a little bit about yourself to start off, please?
Hi there, of course. Thanks very much for having me on your show. Basically, I'm an English teacher, first and foremost, and I started my teaching career in central London, and I worked for a few years in a sort of comprehensive in central London, and I was very lucky that I was promoted really early, so I was promoted to a leadership position in that school. I guess, unfortunately, I worked for about 18 months in that role, and I guess sort of ran myself into the ground, just worked all hours every day, and eventually sort of completely burned out and was quite ill for about a month. So eventually what I decided to do was sort of return back to the classroom, because I wanted to sort of, grow and learn to understand teaching and learning a little bit more, and think about how to manage things like the stress that comes with teaching more as well. So we relocated to the northeast, to the wonderful Newcastle. I'm now in a full-time teaching role. And what I did is initially I started doing a Master's in Education, and I really enjoyed the sort of reflective element of that. And then I set up a blog, which is slowteaching.co.uk. And then I was very lucky in the sense that went quite well. So that's a sort of mix of things about English teaching, managing stress and well-being. And as I say, I was lucky I got a book contract from that. And then sort of last year, I spent about a year writing Slow Teaching. And it's about, I guess, how to find calm, clarity, and a sense of impact in the classroom.
What sort of reception have you received after releasing your book?
To be honest, I've been really surprised about the positive side of it, because I think it's quite a big thing, I guess, putting your work out in such a sort of significant level, and people have been hugely positive and really kind about, how useful they've found, both elements. I guess the idea of how to improve teaching in the classroom, but what's most sort of pleased me really is the whole well-being aspect to it. How many messages I've had online, via Twitter, via the website, about people who've experienced similar things. And, particularly within that first 5 years of teaching, there's a huge amount of burnout. I mean, I'm not sure if the situation is the same in Australia, but certainly in the UK, the amount of teachers we've got leaving the profession, unfortunately, who probably would be offering a huge amount, in classrooms and as teachers. But I've just found it so overwhelming as a profession to manage the workload, to manage the stress, that they've left teaching. So I think, people, as I say, have been, I've hopefully found that aspect useful about ways in which you can more proactively manage stress, and look at strategies to, I guess, sustain a career in teaching, because that's ultimately what we all want. We're committed to the profession. We want to be here for a long period of time, but those first few years are incredibly demanding.
Yeah, we do have the same problem in Australia. I think there's a statistic for us, maybe in the first 5 years, a third of teachers leave the profession. So
That's
we
right.
definitely have the same problem over here in Australia.
And that's depressing, isn't it? Because it's really young, talented people, I'm sure, who, with time and with longevity, teaching does become easier. But that first 5 years, there's a huge amount of pressure to get it right so quickly. And I think we need to be looking, probably across all teachers, about ways in which we can make that easier and more sustainable for people, I think.
Yeah, definitely. So we really liked your analogy of the tortoise and the hare. Can you actually explain that a little bit more for us?
Oh, thank you. So basically, it's based on the fable. So the idea is you've got this sort of plucky hare, this kind of arrogant hare, who challenges the other animals to a race. And obviously no one wants to take him on, because he's sort of talking up his skill and things. And then eventually the humble tortoise agrees and agrees to take this race. Now, obviously the hare sets off a huge rapid pace, but because he's so far ahead, he decides to take a snooze. And the tortoise basically, slowly and incrementally, ends up winning the race, because he takes over the hare when he's sleeping. And I think for me, that was very much kind of encapsulated a lot about education. I think far too often we're looking at the speedy, quick fix of things, rather than considering, the reflection, the pace that we need to do things in order to make learning gains over time. I think, I'm not sure in Australia, but in the UK, certainly when I was training, there was a sort of obsession with outstanding one-off teaching episodes. And part of the criteria of that was this idea of rapid pace. So when I was training in my first few years, I was obsessed with that sort of individual lesson focus. And I would pour hours into sort of preparing these masterpiece lessons, where kids would be hanging from chandeliers. They were so engaged, and there were sort of rockets flying everywhere. But my issue was that nothing was sort of sticking in terms of my students' long-term memory. And they would have these lovely one-off experiences, but over time their learning wasn't improving. And I think I was very much in the sort of Mr. Hare way of doing things. I would run around school, and even when I was sort of promoted into more management, everything was done quickly. I was sending off emails, I was having quick conversations, I was moving really quickly. When in reality, I think, first of all, for our students, what's going to help them more is taking that kind of slower, incremental planning over a series of lessons and being organised in terms of the quality of the curriculum we're offering them, being organised, from an individual teacher point of view about what we're doing through the course of the year for them. So taking that kind of long view of teaching rather than that really sort of focused individual learning experience. And then when I started to think a lot more about that sort of tortoise analogy to teaching, I realised that it can apply to just about every single aspect of teaching. That sense of slowing things down a little bit, reflecting more, considering more, with hugely positive outcomes, I think, as well.
And what brought about that realization that you were potentially going a bit, too quick and managed to actually change to a slower approach? Because obviously you've got a whole book dedicated to it. But
and I think we think of doing things really fast as being really efficient, and then if we're efficient, we've got more time. So what actually brought you to think, okay, actually slowing things down is actually going to help my well-being?
Yeah, I read a book a couple of years ago by Carl Hare, who's a journalist, and it's called In Praise of Slow. And he basically applies this sort of slow lens, if you like, to all aspects of life. And I read it, and I was at a point where I still didn't feel hugely confident about managing stress and about kind of the pace of things I was doing things in the classroom, and from that, as I say, I considered that in terms of everything to do with teaching. And then I guess ultimately what I found was through about 6 months of experimenting in the classroom and slowing all aspects down, that I felt, calmer, more in control in what I was doing. I think my students had more of a sense of learning over time. And then I started to move from what was probably a more kind of blinkered mindset in terms of lots of things I was doing into the classroom into, as I say, more of this overarching view of lots of different aspects. So I think sometimes you need that sort of lightning bolt moment where it's one of the brilliant things, I guess, about reading and reflecting as a teacher, where somebody offers something to you and then it starts to sort of slowly revolutionise what you're doing. Because the other issue, I guess, with sort of improving as a teacher is there's so much out there, and it's brilliant, the online community, the amount of books there is, that we sort of feel this pressure to change things, improve things really quickly. We try things out, and we introduce things into the classroom, but then after a couple of weeks they disappear. Whereas, taking our time with it, experimenting over a course of introducing things slowly tends to have, I think anyway, and from writing the book and things, I think tends to have much more of an impact over a longer period of time.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I'm going to talk to you about your chapter where you talk about non-verbal communication, because that is something that I guess really resonated with me, and I think we learn sort of in university quite early on, but doesn't really get revisited ever again, sort of thing. So why do you think it's important to write about nuanced skills like non-verbal communication?
Well, I think, as I say, I think sometimes we overcomplicate teaching. And as I say, because of the wealth of information there is about teaching and because of the wealth of ideas there is, sometimes we forget that fundamentally a lot of what we're doing is we are standing in front of young people for 6-7 hours a day communicating. And I think that gets lost a little bit. And even, I know it's a little bit of a cliche, but that sort of old adage that teachers are actors. And I think the way in which we communicate in the classroom and the way in which we present ourselves on a non-verbal level is often as important as the content which we're teaching, because it's part of that nuanced way in which we can build positive relationships with students. And I think that sense of building positive relationships is as important as what we're teaching. So I started to think a lot about things like posture, things like how we stand when we're in front of a class can reveal a huge amount about our sort of own anxiety levels, our own stress levels, and can really influence how those young people respond to us. So a lot about kind of standing. I've got terrible posture myself, and it's something I've worked really, really hard on, but kind of standing straight when we're in front of a group of young people can have a huge influence in also how assertive we appear to our students. And also things like hand gestures. There's a fine balance, I think, between, I call it the air traffic controller, where you're waving your arms about everywhere, you're kind of wildly enthusiastic and being, too static. So I actually sort of think that the slow use of our hand gestures can be quite captivating for students. And it sounds a bit bizarre without kind of practicing a little bit yourself, but the way in which we kind of use our hands to communicate sort of key messaging, because young people are, as you'll know yourselves, they're really easily distracted by anything going on in a room. And if we can channel the communication, and non-verbal ways is one of the ways to do that, we can help to sustain their concentration. I think as teachers, that's got to be one of our pretty high up in our prerogatives to make sure they're focused on us. So it's tiny little things. Another thing I was thinking about was the way in which you use eye contact as communicators in the classroom. And I often find that I get this kind of tunnel vision. So I'm looking at certain points in the classroom, but I'm not engaging perhaps one corner. And again, it's not about being sort of slightly creepy and keeping eye contact for far too long. It's just about making sure that everyone in the class feels a part of the sort of the community of the lesson, and you're engaging with individuals, through eye contact, through body language. And Doug Lemov in his books has got a lot about that in terms of, he calls it breaking the plane. So when you are at the front of the room and you've got that invisible line that lots of teachers stand behind and sort of project from the front, but it's also about kind of breaking through that and getting down to students on an individual level and kind of working your way around the room. And for sort of young new teachers, that is one of the real difficulties, having the confidence to get down to students' level and having the confidence to sort of own the teaching space, as it were. And I think all that requires, it's not just at the start of your profession, it's something that as teachers we should be reflecting on all the time, how we communicate non-verbally, I think.
Yeah, I think that is something that a lot of teachers just take for granted because they've been doing it for so long. Like, yeah, I can public speak. Yeah, I can use hand gestures. But I remember there was a part in that chapter that said, picture it's Friday, it's period 5, your shoulders are slumped, you got your hands crossed. And I was sort of actually like, maybe that is me at times. So I think, yeah, just having that awareness of it is really powerful and very important.
Definitely.
Tessa and I really liked part 4 of your book, Slow Classroom Strategies. Personally, I really liked the part on modelling, particularly live modelling. Which strategy has had a profound impact in your classroom?
I'm really pleased that's been helpful. Thank you. I think for me, one of the things that I found really helpful in terms of the research process of writing the book was spending a long time thinking about marking, because I think the situation in the UK has been for some time now that marking has been given this real focus and real priority in terms of moving learning forward and in terms of challenging our students. And I wholeheartedly agree that marking is important, but I think particularly for us that conversation has sort of lost a lot of perspective, and that lots of kind of schools have got these outrageous marking policies where people are required to give extensive written feedback, once a week to the classes, and it all has become a little bit ridiculous, to be honest. And it's one of the main driving factors in the UK why people are leaving the profession, because they're finding that they can't manage the workload, and a huge significant part of that is they can't manage the expectation that they're giving their students lots and lots of written feedback. And I actually think the idea of slow marking is about being a reflective marker and about making sure that you're strategic and planning out, what it is for students that will be marked over the course of a term, and thinking really carefully, again, not just about, the ownership on the teacher, but thinking, well, what are my students going to be doing as a consequence of receiving that written feedback? Because again, marking can be hugely nuanced. There's lots of little strategies you can use to help manage that. So things like using marking codes. As an English teacher, the expectation on us is huge, as it is for lots of other subjects. But I've been experimenting with these marking codes where you don't write out in full the targets. You maybe give numbers and then share them with the class. And then also, this you'll have seen it lots of it on Twitter about kind of marking crib sheets, whereby you write down, while you're marking, you write down some feedback you're going to deliver to the whole class or individuals. So you're not just sort of speeding through a series of 30 books. You are maybe writing less in their books, but thinking more about the implications of what will happen in the classroom that will be different as a consequence of me marking these books. So I found that really, and I think as well, the modelling was a huge aspect that I've now kind of placed much more in my lessons as a consequence of reading and researching. I think often we ask students to do things, we set them off on a task, and we miss the stage that can have a huge impact in the quality of that final outcome for them. So the process of modelling things, of sort of showing them how to do it, of giving them a pre-prepared answer that you've completed yourself is really, really powerful. Because I think what it also does is it shows that as teachers, we're confident, we love our subjects, we like to also do what we're asking them to do. It gives us a huge amount of sort of, credence in their view, in the sense that we are the experts in our subject. And I think when you get the stage where students genuinely think that they're in the hands of an expert, it's incredibly powerful, and they start to hang on every word. So the live modelling is a great way to do that. When you're writing in front of students, or when you're completing an answer in front of students, and then you're talking them through the thought process of it, is really, really powerful. And it stops that moment, that sort of speedy moment in a lesson where you go, right, off you go, do this. And then you've got sort of a handful of students in the class who say, I don't know what I'm doing, I don't understand how to do this. If they've seen a sort of live model or they've seen an example of it, it's just a helpful way for them to grow in confidence as well. And then obviously it's about kind of pulling that back when the class get more confident. And again, that's something that just requires a little bit of thinking as well.
Yeah, look, one of the reasons I really liked the idea of modelling and live modelling is because in the past I've actually surveyed students and asked, what activities do you learn best from? And it seems that there is an overwhelming popularity for, I like it when Miss Johnson gives an exemplar response and talks us through it. But how do we make sure that they're actually really engaging with that and not just reading it and thinking, oh yeah, that's good, I'm going to try and write like that, and then not actually really using it effectively?
Yeah, and that's the balance, isn't it? Because I think sometimes if they become over-reliant on it, you get the sense that they can as well just sort of copy, depending on the subject, but they just copy the example.
And I have seen that before as well.
Yeah. And I think there's a few strategies there. I think part of one of the questioning strategies I've got in the book is this idea of the Pugnacious Probe, whereby whenever you've given somebody a model answer, the questioning as a teacher is really, really important. And the questioning needs to bring in, all aspects of the class. So you're going around going, why have I done that? What's the purpose of that? How does that impact the overall answer? You really are sort of being quite incisive in terms of questioning the students about what it is they're looking at and reading. Other things is this idea of, you can tell you slow a lot in the book, but this idea of slow annotation, whereby, they're not just reading it, it's not just in front of them, but the students are active in terms of writing down and annotating what it is that's been done and why it's successful. And the visualizer is a brilliant way to do that. So you have a visualizer, you put it up on the screen, and you're annotating alongside the students while you're reading it and going through the model answer. Another good trick is to show them a model to a different question that they're going to answer eventually, that has the same sort of thinking process and the same sort of skills, but then they have to complete a slightly different task. Or even just, having a model in front of them for 5 minutes, going through it, but then explaining to them you're going to take that model away from them. You're going to remove that model, so the expectation is they're going to do the task on their own after that. And if they know that there's that sense of, slight sense of panic that, this wonderful, beautiful piece of work is going to vanish in a second, then they're slightly more likely to focus their thinking in on kind of taking in what that model answer might be saying to them. I think it's a difficult boundary. I completely agree, but it just again requires reflection on ways in which the students can, learn from the model, but also develop independence as well, I think.
So next question is kind of similar, but what are the top 3 wellbeing tips you would suggest for a new graduate teacher?
Oh, break it down to top 3. It's a tricky one.
And we'll be listening because we're both new graduates.
That's even more pressure then. I think, I know this is a little bit, I guess it's a little bit cheesy, but I think the first one ultimately, I think there is a sort of, there's a narrative that to be a wonderful, incredible teacher, you need to devote everything to your students, and you need to become a kind of self-sacrificing figure at the altar, who's up all night planning wildly exciting lessons, who's marking books until he collapse on a heap in the middle of the night. And I think that's quite a damaging narrative, because I think in order to give the best to young people, you need to ultimately prioritize your own well-being, and you need to be able to first of all function as an adult and as a human being, and to do that I think you need to as I say, put your well-being first, and that involves, I think, getting adequate sleep, that involves having a life outside of the classroom, and that involves I think not letting teaching take over your life, I think would be my number one. Because if you can do that, if you can have that slightly more dispassionate approach to it, you can still be incredibly passionate, and you can still, put a lot into your job, but not let it completely overwhelm and dominate you. Because I think that's where this idea of this long view of education is really important. It's sometimes difficult to remember that for me, I'll have another 30 odd years in the profession. And sometimes you feel this sense as a graduate, you've got to get things really quickly. You've got to sort things, you've got to do things, and that can be come overwhelming. The second one, I think, and I remember when I lived in Australia for a year, and I think Australian people are huge about this, but I think exercise is such a hugely important thing in terms of managing your well-being. And it's not necessarily something, hugely intense, but I think just making the time to get outside, to go for a walk, to go for a jog, to go for a cycle, to go for a swim. And for me, that has been one of the, definitely one of the best ways to manage stress, because it just gets all those lovely positive endorphins flying around. It just helps you to get that little sense of perspective that, tomorrow's a new day, you can start again, you can keep going. So secondly, I think exercise is really important. And then the third and final thing, to sort of, as a theme that's run through this, is making the time to reflect. And it sounds like you've got brilliant systems to do that in your school, but they're not always there. And I think making the time to reflect doesn't necessarily mean reflecting the negatives, which is another thing we're prone to do as people entering the profession. I think reflecting on the joys, and even just writing down at the end of a day, 2-3 things that have gone well, that are positive, can really sort of nurture a tired soul. And it's difficult sometimes. You don't realise the good things you do in the classroom, in education, in school on a daily basis. And actually making the time to just remember them and recall them. And, if writing's not something, that is your way of reflecting, just finding some way to recognize and slow down and think, actually, I did that really well. I think that can have a real impact in positivity and well-being. This well-being can be, I don't want to say overly simplified, but I think to have well-being, you need to find value and meaning in what you're doing, and reflecting on the positives is one of the ways you can do that, I think.
Wonderful. So that is having realistic expectations, to exercise and to take time to reflect on the positives. Like the sound of that?
Fantastic.
Just last up, for our listeners, could you please let us know what your Twitter handle is and where they can find a copy of your book?
Absolutely. So I'm on Twitter as TeachGratitude1, and then Slow Teaching is available in probably Amazon, to be honest, would be the easiest way. It's just Slow Teaching, finding calm, clarity and impact in the classroom.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much again, Jamie, for agreeing to be interviewed with us. We have learnt so much, and it's really, really nice to focus on wellbeing, particularly when we're at the tail end of term 2 over here in Australia, and reports are due, marks are coming in, so it's pretty high pressure, but it's nice, a really nice sort of mantra to preach to slow down.
Not a problem at all. Thank you very much. It's an absolute pleasure speaking to you this morning. Thank you very much for having me.
Our next guest, James Ramsey, is Head of Humanities at Corpus Christi College and is a strong believer in low-stakes, high-impact teaching and learning. James is a big supporter of research-based pedagogy and has been working to implement a range of practical strategies into his learning area.
So welcome, James, and thank you so much for agreeing to talk to us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Great. So for our listeners, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself, please?
Yeah, so I've been at Corpus Christi College now for almost 11 years, and in that time I've been Head of Humanities for around 5.5 years, and I really enjoy that role. I feel as though I am able to have an impact in terms of influencing teaching and learning, particularly within my learning area, but also have the capacity also to work with other teachers and coach them and really help to build their capacity as well, which I enjoy.
Okay, great. James, I know one of your focuses for the last few years has been formative assessment. Can you tell us a little bit about what you have been doing with formative assessment in the past 2 years?
Yeah, so I think when I reflected on assessments in general, I sort of came to the realisation that summative assessment has been elevated to such sort of lofty heights that it's almost become the number one sort of concern of students and parents and teachers. So it's very easy to become sort of driven by assessments, and I think that really can create a lot of anxiety and stress, and can be very time consuming, but doesn't necessarily have a major impact on learning. And they really judge their success based on their grade. They don't necessarily see assessments as a I suppose something that is just formalising what they're learning in the classroom. They just focus on the score, the grade, how that compares to their partner, and it can become something that results in a lot of anxiety. So I think one problem is that we probably do too many assessments in general. We spend too much time marking, providing lengthy written comments that often aren't understood or read. I think it really required sort of a paradigm shift. I don't think this is really sustainable. So that obviously takes a bit of time, but my focus has been more on the learning and progressing the learning, more so than focusing on assessment. So providing more ongoing feedback to students to sort of help them move forward. So our goal really has been, in Humanities, has been more feedback, less marking.
Yeah, and I totally agree with that. And you've mentioned, obviously, shifting the mindset for students and for teachers, but you mentioned earlier also parents. And I think that's a really important thing as well, because quite often if a child doesn't do that well in their assessment, you get an email the next day from the parents sort of saying, what are you doing wrong and what is my kid doing wrong? And I think they a lot of the time think that it's a reflection of their intelligence rather than, maybe just not grasping some course concepts that well. So yeah, you are correct in saying I think that it's got to shift in every party, students, teachers, and parents.
You also mentioned the anxiety that a lot of students tend to have with summative assessments. Have you noticed a bit of a change towards that anxiety because of the amounts of formative assessments you're now doing?
I think students are better able, by doing sort of more low stakes type assessments and giving more ongoing feedback, I think students are better able to recognise sort of what they know, what they don't know, where they can improve on, so that they're getting feedback prior to the assessment. So I think in that case, I am starting to see a bit more of a shift in terms of students knowing perhaps areas that they need to study prior to the assessment, that it's not just they study everything, that it's about giving them more awareness of what they know, what they don't know, and therefore helping them to focus on those areas that they don't know as well. So therefore, it's kind of streamlining that process of revision, and I think they're becoming more used to. It's become more of a routine in terms of like starting a lesson with a quiz, or we might start with some multiple choice questions. So it's about definitely changing that culture about in relation to feedback, making it a more ongoing process for sure.
Yeah, that's great. We know you've read professional development books such as Make Every Lesson Count by Andy Tharby, which we both absolutely loved as well. So what are some of the main principles which underpin your teaching and learning philosophy?
Yeah, I think making every lesson count is fantastic in terms of it almost provides a manual for how to teach. And I don't think I'd ever had a manual about how to teach before. So what I really liked about that is that it emphasised key aspects of what we do on an everyday basis in terms of questioning and explaining and modelling, providing opportunities for practice, giving feedback effectively, and also provided some simple strategies that we could employ to sort of hone that craft. So that's what I really liked about that. It also reinforced to me that effective teaching can be quite teacher-directed as well. And there's a particular part I enjoyed from the book about struggle being the key to learning. So I've really kind of embraced that in my classroom as well, that when you've got lots of students in the class who are kind of struggling and finding it difficult, that's often when the best learning takes place. So that's definitely something that's kind of resonated with me. Also the importance of challenging students. So that's definitely been something that I often sort of refer back to. Also, I've just started reading Thomas Sherrington, The Learning Rainforest. I'm about halfway through that. So the first half is kind of theory-based and the next half is practical. I haven't got to the practical part yet, but that's up there with making every lesson count in terms of just being a fantastic guide to great teaching and learning. And what has come out of that is the idea of developing a sort of knowledge-rich curriculum, like focusing on mainly what to teach and why to teach rather than just the how to teach, that before we get to the how to teach, we need to actually focus on really developing students' knowledge. I, obviously being a humanities teacher, I want my kids to think critically, to think deeply, to solve problems, to apply their learning, but I think they need that sort of really strong knowledge base. So that's something that I think really underpins my my teaching philosophy, as well as I think I've become a lot more sort of teacher-centred. I employed more of a sort of direct teaching process, more so in the last few years. I think when I first started teaching, it was more maybe inquiry-based, discovery-based learning. And I still think that's important, but I think it's underpinned by that strong knowledge base. But also, I suppose what's crucial to my philosophy would be having high expectations for all students, challenging them. So that idea of that Goldilocks level of challenge, but really challenging students to do their best, developing strong relationships with students, creating a really positive learning environment, and always being aware of that why question. So why are we doing this particular task? How will this help you to progress your learning?
So as we know, and I'm sure you know as well, Corpus is an iPad school. How has technology helped enhance formative assessment? Like, are there any tools you'd recommend or apps?
There's probably two that I mainly focus on, and they would be Padlet. So I really like using Padlet for two different ways. One would be as a way of enabling students to provide questions. That might be like why questions at the start of the unit that you can often start lessons with. That might be outside of the curriculum but still interesting and relevant and can help to engage students. But also for doing particularly short writing tasks where I might put a success criteria on there, clarify that with them, go through what I expect, and then students can either put their name on their piece of work or they can do it anonymously. You can provide feedback on how they're going in relation to the success criteria, so that enables you to get sort of whole class feedback on how they're going, but also you can individualize it and you can provide individual feedback. You can even incorporate a bit of peer assessing as well. So I really like that. But probably the main one that I use actually now is Quizzes. I think that is fantastic. Probably in the early years of my teaching, I maybe shied away from using multiple choice questions, but I've realised that it's a really efficient way of getting a lot of information about your students and what they know and what they don't know. So you get fantastic feedback. It's a tool whereby you put multiple choice questions in there. There's already a whole bank of questions that you can use. I tend to use exam questions, so they're of a high quality, and you get, again, whole class feedback. You also get individual feedback, which then influences what you do next as a teacher. So I think that's really important, that you're constantly adapting based on the feedback that you're getting. So often I think the rule that I have is that I will go through all of the questions where the success rate was about 65% or less, and we'll go through that question, and generally I'll ask a student to explain what they think the answer is and then go through their reasoning. And it's only when I'm not satisfied that they've understood and explained it effectively that I'll sort of clarify any misconceptions and go over it in more detail. But that's often really useful. I found as a homework activity. So you can ask, say, 20 questions. It might take 10 minutes to complete, and then you get great feedback, which then can help inform what you do at the start of the next lesson.
Yeah, and I like how your approach is, particularly when you're talking about multiple choice, and that approach as well is very, very time effective, because as we know, any teacher will tell you that they are time poor. Is there anything else you can think of where teachers can save time in their formative assessment? Because I think that's the main anxiety that exists around formative assessment, is that it's more time basically.
I think I know that I've done less assessments in year 11 and 12. We've cut it down to the bare minimum. So we're doing 8 assessments in year 11 and 8 assessments in year 12. So what I'm trying to do is, more ongoing feedback on a day-to-day basis, every lesson, trying to interact with students regularly, checking their work, reading their work, asking them questions, asking them how they can improve on their response, but then saying, if they can't identify how they can improve, sometimes you need to give that feedback. So this is what I would recommend you do. In 10 minutes time, I'm going to come back and I'm going to check that, because it's important that they obviously act on that feedback, but then you would come back and you would check that. But just in general, like you said, we really are time poor. So one of the challenges is, I think, working out what is most effective, what really works, and focusing more of your energy on that. So I found more of a teacher-directed approach has actually probably saved me a fair bit of time. I think in the past I might have spent hours thinking about how might I start the lesson or how might I end the lesson, and it might have been really fun and engaging, but it took a lot of time, and I'm not sure it necessarily fitted in with the learning, and I'm not necessarily sure that it had a big impact on the learning. So cutting out those things that don't have a big impact and focusing more of my energy on what does make an impact, and probably having more of a routine as well. So if you can develop good quality questions multiple choice questions or quiz questions or short answer questions, you can reuse them again. So doing more of those sorts of things and reinventing the wheel a little bit less. And also there's great resources out there that have been invented already. You don't necessarily have to start from scratch. So there's obviously great ideas on Twitter, which I engage with and use as well. Also less written comments, definitely. So using a marking code, for example. So identifying some common errors or some common areas that students often have in their work, giving them information on how they can improve on that aspect, giving more verbal feedback, a lot more verbal feedback than written comments, more whole class feedback as well.
Yeah, thanks so much, James. That's all our questions, but thank you so much for joining us and for all your knowledge about formative assessment and some of your great ideas as well.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, James. Thanks so much for listening to the Staffroom, and thanks to our guests, Jamie Thom and James Ramsey. If you'd like to follow us on Twitter, my handle is Michael_Royale and Tessa's is Tessa_Johnson too.
Please make sure you subscribe to our podcast on either iTunes or Stitcher, and feel free to leave a review and give us any feedback on the show. This has been the 8th and final episode of the Staffroom for this series. Look out for an update on the release of Series 2 in the near future.
I'm Michael Royale.
And I'm Tessa Johnson.
Thanks for listening.